They say a man who has nothing left to lose becomes the most dangerous creature alive. But what about a man who never had anything real to begin with? A man whose entire existence was built on duty, power, and the suffocating weight of a name that demanded perfection. Watch what happens when that man finally cracks, when obsession becomes the only truth he knows, and the past he buried claws its way back to destroy everything. Stay until the end, because what starts as one man's descent into madness becomes something far more terrifying, a reckoning that will shatter every lie this family ever told. The first snow of the season fell on Blackthorn Hall like ash from a funeral pyre. Adrian Blackthorn stood at the window of his study, watching the flakes settle on the barren grounds, and felt nothing. He had trained himself not to feel for so long that the absence had become a second skin, a armor more reliable than anything his title could provide. 42 years old, Duke of one of England's oldest estates, respected, feared, utterly hollow. The knock at his door was soft, hesitant. His steward, Graves, understood better than anyone that interruptions were tolerated only when absolutely necessary. "Come in." Graves entered, his weathered face carefully neutral. "Your Grace, the matter we discussed last week. The woman has been found." Adrian turned from the window slowly. His movements were always measured, deliberate. 20 years of maintaining absolute control had made spontaneity impossible. "Where?" "A boarding house in Whitechapel. She's been working as a seamstress under the name Evelyn Voss." Graves paused, then added quietly, "The resemblance is uncanny, Your Grace." Something flickered behind Adrian's gray eyes. Not hope. He had murdered that emotion long ago. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faint stirring of a hunger he had starved for 2 decades. "Bring her here." Graves shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Your Grace, perhaps it would be wiser to—" "I said bring her here." Adrian's voice remained low, but the command in it was absolute. "Within 3 days, offer her whatever sum necessary." After Graves left, Adrian returned to the window. The snow was falling harder now, burying the dead gardens beneath a blanket of white. Somewhere in this godforsaken house, his wife Serafina was likely in her sitting room, surrounded by her books and her careful distance. They had perfected the art of existing in the same space without truly seeing each other, a marriage built on obligation, maintained through indifference. He pressed his palm against the cold glass and allowed himself to remember what he usually kept locked away. Silver blue eyes, a laugh like breaking crystal, the scent of jasmine and rain. Celeste, 23 years since her death. 23 years of waking up every morning and remembering how her body had looked at the bottom of the East Tower stairs, her neck bent at an impossible angle, her eyes still open and staring at nothing. 23 years of knowing the truth everyone else refused to see. Celeste Arden had not fallen. She had been pushed, and Adrian, young and terrified and desperate to protect the Blackthorn name, had helped his father bury the evidence and call it an accident. He pulled his hand away from the window, leaving a ghostly print on the glass. The snow continued to fall, erasing everything beneath it, making the world look clean and innocent. He had learned long ago that innocence was a luxury afforded only to those who never looked beneath the surface. 3 days later, Evelyn Voss arrived at Blackthorn Hall in a hired carriage, her few possessions packed in a single worn trunk. She stood in the entrance hall, her dark cloak dusted with snow, and looked around with wide eyes that took in the vaulted ceilings, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, the oppressive grandeur of old money and older secrets. Adrian watched from the gallery above, hidden in shadow. Even from this distance, the resemblance stole his breath. Not just similar, identical. The same delicate bone structure, the same silver blue eyes, the same way she tilted her head slightly when listening, as if the world spoke a language only she could truly hear. Mrs. Hendricks, the head housekeeper, was explaining something about the east wing being closed for renovation. Evelyn nodded, her movements graceful and uncertain at once. She looked impossibly young, though he knew from the investigator's report she was 26, the same age Celeste had been when she died. "Your Grace." Adrian turned to find Serafina standing behind him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. His wife at 41 was still beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished, refined, untouchable. Her dark hair was swept back in an elegant chignon, her gray dress perfectly tailored. They had not shared a bed in 7 years. They barely shared conversation. "You actually brought her here," Serafina said quietly. Her voice carried no surprise, only a weary resignation. "I hired her as a seamstress. We need one. We have 3 seamstresses in the village." Serafina stepped closer, her hazel eyes searching his face. "What are you doing, Adrian?" He met her gaze without flinching. "What I should have done 20 years ago." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw something like pity cross her features. "That's what terrifies me," she said softly. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. Adrian descended the stairs slowly. Evelyn looked up as he approached, and her eyes widened. Up close, the resemblance was even more profound. Not just the features, but the way she held herself, that strange combination of vulnerability and quiet strength that had first drawn him to Celeste all those years ago. "Miss Voss." His voice was formal, distant. "Welcome to Blackthorn Hall." She curtsied awkwardly, clearly unused to the gesture. "Your Grace, thank you for the opportunity. I don't quite understand why you've offered me such generous terms, but I'm grateful. You come highly recommended." He gestured for Mrs. Hendricks to continue the tour. "You'll find everything you need. If you require anything further, inform the staff." As she was led away, she glanced back once. Their eyes met, and Adrian felt something crack in the carefully constructed walls around his heart. It was not love. He was incapable of that now. It was something darker. Recognition. The echo of a ghost he had never properly mourned. That night, Adrian stood in his study with a glass of whiskey he would not drink and a letter he had read 1,000 times. Celeste's handwriting, the last word she had ever written to him, discovered years after her death hidden in a book of poetry. "Adrian, I've learned something terrible. Something that involves your father and men I thought were honorable. I don't know who to trust anymore, but I know I must tell someone. Meet me tonight in the East Tower. Please come alone. Please believe me." See, he had been 22, drunk, and angry over some trivial argument he could no longer remember. He had not gone to meet her. By the time he stumbled into the hall the next morning, she was already dead, and his father was already orchestrating the cover-up with cold efficiency. "Your friend had too much wine at dinner and took a tragic fall. These things happen. We'll handle the authorities quietly. No scandal. The Blackthorn name remains unblemished." Adrian had been too young and too cowardly to fight him, so he had stayed silent while they buried Celeste in the family cemetery with a stone that called her death an accident. He had stayed silent while the whispers died down and society moved on to fresher gossip. He had stayed silent when 3 years later his father arranged his marriage to Serafina Whitmore, a union of 2 powerful families that meant absolutely nothing beyond politics and property. And for 20 years, the silence had been eating him alive. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Graves entered, looking troubled. "Your Grace, I feel obliged to mention that some of the staff are uncomfortable with Miss Voss's presence." "Why?" "The resemblance, Your Grace, to the portrait in the East Gallery. Several of the older servants remember Miss Arden. They find it disturbing. Then they can seek employment elsewhere." Adrian set down his glass. "Miss Voss is under my protection. Anyone who makes her feel unwelcome will be dismissed immediately." "Is that understood?" Graves inclined his head. "Of course, Your Grace." He hesitated. "May I speak freely?" "You always do, eventually. What you're doing, bringing her here, keeping her close, it won't bring Celeste Arden back, and it won't ease whatever guilt you carry." Adrian smiled without humor. "I'm not trying to bring anyone back, Graves. I'm trying to correct a mistake. There's a difference." After Graves left, Adrian walked through the darkened halls of Blackthorn Hall, past generations of ancestors glaring down from their portraits, past rooms filled with furniture no one used and memories no one wanted. He climbed the stairs to the East Tower, the one part of the estate that had been closed off for 23 years. The door was locked, but he had the key. He always had the key. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been the night Celeste died. Dust covered the furniture. Cobwebs hung in the corners. The window where she might have fallen, or been pushed, stood open slightly, letting in the cold night air. Adrian crossed to the window and looked down at the stones below. From here, the drop was easily fatal. Quick, probably. Relatively painless if the fall broke her neck immediately. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, and finally allowed himself to ask the question he had avoided for 2 decades. Who had killed her? His father was dead now, 7 years in the ground. Whatever secrets he had taken to his grave would stay buried. But Celeste's letter had mentioned others, men she thought were honorable, conspirators and something terrible enough to kill for. And now, standing in this room where everything had ended, Adrian made a decision that would either destroy what remained of his life or finally give it purpose. He would find out the truth, no matter the cost, no matter who it destroyed, starting with himself. Over the following weeks, Evelyn settled into life at Blackthorn Hall with a quiet grace that unnerved everyone around her. She worked in the sewing room during the day, repairing the household's linens and clothing with skillful hands. She took her meals with the senior staff. She kept to herself, polite but distant, as if sensing the strange tension her presence created. Adrian watched her constantly. Not openly, he was too practiced at deception for that, but he found reasons to pass by the sewing room, to encounter her in the halls, to observe her from windows and doorways when she walked in the snow-covered gardens during her brief afternoon breaks. He told himself he was looking for proof, some sign that she was connected to Celeste beyond mere physical resemblance, some clue that might unlock the mystery of what had happened that night. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. He was obsessed. Serafina noticed, of course. His wife might have stopped caring about him years ago, but she was not blind. "You're going to destroy what little remains of your reputation," she said one evening, as they sat in the drawing room, maintaining the pretense of companionship for the servant's sake. Staring at a young woman half your age like she's a ghost you're trying to resurrect. Adrian turned a page in the book he was not reading. "I don't stare." Everyone has noticed, Adrian, the staff gossips. Our friends, or what passes for friends in our circles, are beginning to ask questions. She set down her embroidery and looked at him directly. "What do you want from her?" "The truth." Serafina laughed bitterly. "The truth about what? That she looks like someone you knew decades ago? That's not truth, Adrian. That's coincidence. Or delusion." He closed his book and met her gaze. "Celeste Arden was murdered, Serafina, and my father helped cover it up. I intend to find out why and who was responsible." His wife paled slightly. "That's ancient history. Let it stay buried." "Why? Because it's convenient? Because exposing the truth might tarnish the precious Blackthorn name? Because digging up the past won't change anything?" Serafina's composure finally cracked. "It won't bring her back. It won't make you whole. It will only destroy whatever fragile peace we've managed to build here." "We don't have peace." Adrian stood, his voice cold and final. "We have a ceasefire. There's a difference." He left her sitting alone in the drawing room, surrounded by luxury and loneliness in equal measure. That night, he found Evelyn in the library. She was standing before the portrait of Celeste Arden that hung above the fireplace, the one painting his father had not destroyed. Celeste at 20, captured in oils by a talented artist, her silver blue eyes seeming to follow whoever entered the room. Evelyn turned as Adrian approached, startled. "Your Grace, I didn't mean to intrude. Mrs. Hendricks said the library was open to staff, but if I'm not supposed to be here, You're fine." He moved to stand beside her, both of them looking up at Celeste's portrait. "What do you think of her?" Evelyn studied the painting carefully. "She looks sad, even though she's smiling, like she's trying to hide something painful." Adrian felt his chest tighten. "That's remarkably perceptive." "Who was she?" "Someone I failed." He said it without thinking, the truth escaping before he could stop it. Evelyn looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw intelligence in those silver blue eyes, curiosity, and something else, a wariness that suggested she understood what it meant to be the subject of a powerful man's attention. "I should return to my quarters," she said quietly. "Good night, Your Grace." "Wait." The word came out more forcefully than he intended. She froze, and he saw fear flicker across her face. He immediately softened his tone. "I meant no command. He struggled to find words that would not sound insane. "Do you know anything about your family, your parents?" She frowned, confused by the question. "I was raised in an orphanage in Dover. I don't know who my parents were. Why do you ask?" "Because you look exactly like her." He gestured to the portrait. "And I don't believe in coincidence." Evelyn stared at him. her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Your Grace, I think you're mistaken. Lots of people share similar features. Not like this. Adrian stepped closer, and she stepped back instinctively. Your eyes. The way you tilt your head when you're thinking. Even your voice. It's as if she's come back. I'm not whoever you think I am. Evelyn's voice was firm now, defensive. I'm just a seamstress, a nobody, and I think I should leave Blackthorn Hall. No. The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to acknowledge. You're free to leave whenever you wish, Adrian said carefully, trying to regain control. I have no legal authority to keep you here, but I'm asking you to stay. He paused. Please. Evelyn searched his face, and he wondered what she saw there. Madness? Desperation? The ruins of a man who had spent 20 years drowning in guilt? Why? She asked softly. Because I think you're connected to something that happened here long ago, something terrible that was covered up. And I think finding the truth might be the only way to free both of us from the past. She shook her head slowly. I don't understand any of this. Neither do I. Not yet. But I will. Adrian's voice hardened with determination. I promise you, Miss Voss, I will uncover whatever secrets this house is hiding, even if it destroys me in the process. Evelyn looked back at the portrait of Celeste, then at Adrian, then down at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've been having dreams since I arrived here. Strange dreams about places in this house I've never been. About people I've never met. About falling. Adrian felt ice slide down his spine. What kind of falling? From a great height. In the dreams, I'm standing at a window, and someone is behind me, and then I'm falling, and I can't scream because the air is rushing past too fast, and I know when I hit the ground, everything will end. The East Tower, Adrian breathed. What? Nothing. He forced himself to stay calm even as his mind raced. These dreams, when did they start? The first night I slept in this house. They stared at each other in the fire-lit library, the portrait of Celeste watching over them both, and Adrian knew with absolute certainty that this young woman was not just a coincidence. She was the key to unlocking a truth that had been buried for far too long. And someone, somewhere in this house, knew it too. The next morning, Adrian began his investigation in earnest. He started in the place where all family secrets lived, the archives in the basement, where generations of Blackthorn correspondence, ledgers, and private papers were stored in dust-covered boxes. He spent hours sorting through documents from 23 years ago, looking for anything that might explain what Celeste had discovered. Financial records, business dealings, social correspondence, the mundane detritus of aristocratic life, most of it meaningless. Until he found the letter. It was hidden in a false bottom of a box containing his father's personal papers, sealed in wax that had long since cracked. The handwriting was not his father's, but belonged to someone else, someone whose signature made Adrian's blood run cold. Lord Edmund Fairfax, his father's closest friend, a man who had served in Parliament for 30 years, a man who had died 5 years ago in his sleep, respected and mourned by all of high society. The letter was dated 3 days before Celeste's death. Blackthorn. The Arden girl knows about the consortium. I don't know how she found out, but she's been asking questions. Dangerous questions. We need to handle this quietly and permanently. The others are nervous. Ashford wants to accelerate our timeline, but I think that's reckless. Meet me tomorrow night. We need a unified strategy before this situation compromises everything we've built. Fairfax. Adrian read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. The consortium. A unified strategy. Handle this quietly and permanently. They had killed her. Not in a moment of passion or accident, but with premeditation. A calculated murder to protect some business arrangement involving his father and other powerful men. And Adrian had helped them bury the evidence without even knowing what he was protecting. He was still sitting there, the letter in his hands, when Graves found him. Your Grace, we have a situation. Adrian looked up, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. What kind of situation? Miss Voss has been injured. Adrian was on his feet instantly. How? She was walking in the east garden and something fell from above, a piece of masonry from the tower. It missed her by inches, but she was cut by debris. Mrs. Hendricks is tending to her now. Adrian was already moving, taking the stairs two at a time, his heart pounding. An accident. Of course they would call it an accident, just like they had with Celeste. He found Evelyn in her small room, sitting on the edge of the bed while Mrs. Hendricks bandaged a cut on her temple. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. "Everyone out," Adrian commanded. "Now!" Mrs. Hendricks looked startled but obeyed, closing the door behind her. Adrian knelt in front of Evelyn, his hands hovering near her face without quite touching. "Are you all right?" She nodded, but her eyes were wide with shock. It came from nowhere. "I was just walking, and suddenly there was this terrible sound, and stones were falling, and you're safe now." His voice was surprisingly gentle. "I promise you, you're safe." But Evelyn shook her head. No, I'm not." She looked at him directly. "Whatever is happening in this house, whatever you're caught up in, it's dangerous. Someone just tried to kill me, didn't they?" Adrian wanted to lie, to tell her it was just an accident, that she was imagining things, that she was perfectly safe under his protection. But he had spent 20 years living in lies, and he found he could not stomach one more. "Yes," he said quietly, "I believe someone did. And I believe they killed someone else 23 years ago to protect a secret. And I think that secret has something to do with why you look exactly like the woman they murdered." Evelyn closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "I want to leave. I want to pack my things and leave right now and never come back to this cursed place." "You can." Adrian's voice was steady. "I won't stop you, but they will. Whoever tried to kill you today knows you're a threat. If you leave, you'll be vulnerable. If you stay, at least I can protect you." "How?" she demanded, opening her eyes. "How can you protect me when you don't even know who you're protecting me from?" He had no answer for that. Not yet. But he would find one. Because standing there, looking at this young woman who wore a dead woman's face and had somehow inherited a dead woman's enemies, Adrian Blackthorne made a vow. He would uncover the truth about the consortium his father had been part of. He would identify every man who had conspired to murder Celeste Arden, and he would make them pay for what they had done, even if it meant destroying his family's name, even if it meant losing everything he had left, even if it meant becoming the very monster high society had always whispered he might be, because 23 years of silence had bought him nothing but emptiness, and he would not let another innocent woman die to protect someone else's sins. The game had changed. The past was no longer buried. And Adrian Blackthorne, the cold and feared duke who felt nothing, discovered he could still feel one thing very clearly: rage. Then, later that night, as Evelyn tried to sleep despite the throbbing pain in her head, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door. Slow, deliberate, stopping directly outside. She held her breath, staring at the door handle, waiting for it to turn. It never did. But a piece of paper slid under the door, pale against the dark floor. When the footsteps finally retreated, Evelyn got out of bed and picked up the paper with shaking hands. There was only one sentence, written in elegant script. She should have stayed silent too. The note lay on Evelyn's nightstand like a coiled snake, the elegant script somehow more threatening than any crude warning could have been. She stared at it until the words blurred, until the paper itself seemed to pulse with malice in the dim candlelight. She should have stayed silent too. The word carried the weight of an admission. Whoever had written this knew exactly what had happened to Celeste Arden, and they were telling Evelyn she would suffer the same fate if she did not disappear. But where could she go? Back to the filthy boarding house in Whitechapel, where rats outnumbered tenants, and every day was a fight to earn enough for stale bread? Back to a life where she was invisible, worthless, nobody? At least here, she was someone, even if that someone wore a dead woman's face. Evelyn folded the note carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her nightgown. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the corridor. If they wanted her dead, let them try while she was looking them in the eye. The hall was empty, silent except for the distant ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere below. Every portrait on the walls seemed to watch her as she moved toward the main staircase, her bare feet soundless on the cold marble. She had no plan beyond confronting Adrian Blackthorne and demanding real answers instead of cryptic warnings and guilty obsessions. She found him exactly where she expected, In his study, surrounded by papers and ledgers, a glass of untouched whiskey catching the firelight. He looked up as she entered without knocking, and something dangerous flickered across his face before settling back into that mask of perfect control. "You should be resting. Someone slipped a death threat under my door." Evelyn crossed the room and dropped the note onto his desk. "Hard to rest when you know someone in this house wants you dead." Adrian picked up the paper and read it, his jaw tightening. His hands, those careful, aristocratic hands that had probably never thrown a punch in their life, clenched around the edges hard enough to crumple it. "Who gave this to you?" "I don't know." "I heard footsteps. By the time I opened the door, they were gone." She leaned forward, hands flat on his desk. "But you know, don't you? You know who killed Celeste Arden. You've probably known for years." "I suspected. I didn't have proof." He met her gaze, and she saw something raw and wounded beneath the cold exterior. "Until today." He pulled a yellowed letter from the pile of documents and handed it to her. Evelyn read it once, then again, her stomach turning with each word. "The consortium," she said slowly. "What is it?" "I don't know yet. Some kind of business arrangement between my father and other powerful men. Something illegal enough that they murdered to protect it." Adrian stood and moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames. "Lord Fairfax is dead. But the letter mentions others. Ashford. That would be Viscount Ashford. He's still alive, still influential in Parliament. If I can find out who else was involved, then what?" Evelyn's voice was sharper than she intended. "You expose them? Destroy their reputations?" Her laugh was bitter. "Men like that don't fall, Your Grace. They push other people off towers and walk away clean." "Not this time." "Why?" She moved closer, studying his profile. "Because you feel guilty? Because you spent 20 years pretending you didn't help cover up a murder?" He turned on her then, and she saw real anger break through that controlled facade. "You think I don't know what I am? You think I've forgotten for even one day that I'm complicit in her death? That I was too weak and too cowardly to stand up to my father? So this is redemption? Playing detective with someone who looks like your dead girlfriend? She was more than that." The words came out like broken glass. She was brilliant and curious, and she saw through all the pretense of this world we live in. She asked questions no one else dared to ask, and they killed her for it. His voice dropped. "And I let them." The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of guilt and fresh fear. "Why do I look like her?" Evelyn asked quietly. Adrian's expression shifted, became almost gentle. "That's what I'm trying to find out. The timing suggests—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "Celeste disappeared from society for several months before she died. People assumed she was visiting family in Scotland, but if she was actually pregnant and if she gave birth to a daughter—" "No." Evelyn shook her head violently. "That's insane. You're creating fantasy to justify your obsession with a stranger. I had my investigator look into your background. There are no records of you before age 5 when you appeared at the orphanage. Someone paid for your care there. Anonymous donations made quarterly through a solicitor's office that burned down 12 years ago. All records lost." She felt dizzy suddenly, the room tilting. People abandon children all the time. It doesn't mean— Celeste had a distinctive birthmark. Small. Right side of her lower back, shaped like a crescent moon. Evelyn's hand moved unconsciously to her own back, to the exact spot where a small crescent-shaped mark had always existed. A mark she had never thought twice about until this moment. "How would you know that?" she whispered. "Because I knew her intimately," Adrian said flatly. "Before your moral judgment overwhelms you, understand that we grew up together. I planned to marry her, and then my father decided a duke's son couldn't marry a baron's daughter with no fortune, so he arranged my engagement to Serafina instead. Celeste and we said goodbye. Or we tried to. So I'm what? The bastard daughter you never knew about? You're the daughter they wanted erased because she was evidence of something that could have destroyed the conspiracy before it began." Adrian's voice hardened. "Think about it. If Celeste had a child, people would ask questions. Who was the father? Why was she hiding? She was unmarried. Scandal enough. But if she started asking dangerous questions about business dealings while also pregnant, they would have seen her as a threat that needed to be eliminated completely." The room seemed to shrink around Evelyn. Her entire life, the orphanage, the hunger, the years of being nobody, all of it orchestrated by men who wanted to bury evidence of their crimes. If this is true, she said slowly, then I'm not just some seamstress who looks like your lost love. I'm a witness to murder. Just by existing, I prove they had motive, which is why they tried to kill you today. Adrian moved closer. And why they'll try again. These men have spent 2 decades maintaining their secret. They won't let it unravel now. Then we're both dead. She laughed without humor. You for digging up evidence, me for being born. Not if we move first. Adrian's eyes gleamed with something that looked almost alive. There's a masquerade ball in 2 weeks. The annual Ashford Winter Gala. Every member of high society will be there, including whoever else was part of this consortium. He paused. I want you there. Visible. Unavoidable. Let them see what they thought they'd buried. You want to use me as bait. I want to force their hand. Make them nervous enough to make mistakes. Adrian's voice dropped to something almost like intimacy. I know what I'm asking. I know the risk. But if we do nothing, they pick us off one at a time in staged accidents. If we go on the offensive, we might just die faster. Or we might finally get justice for the woman whose face you inherited and whose death ruined more lives than you can imagine. Evelyn stared at him, this cold duke who was asking her to walk into a room full of potential murderers and smile while wearing a mask. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into London's slums where at least poverty was an enemy she understood. But something else stirred beneath the fear, something that had lived nameless inside her for 26 years, waiting. The anger of being unwanted, the rage of being erased, the desperate clawing need to matter. If I do this, she said quietly, I'm not doing it for your redemption. I'm doing it because for the first time in my life I want to know who I actually am, even if the answer destroys me. Adrian nodded slowly. Then we understand each other. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Your Grace? If this goes wrong and we both end up dead, it won't. You can't promise that. No. His smile was grim. But I can promise that if we die, we'll take them down with us. After Evelyn left, Adrian stood alone in his study and allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had been avoiding. He was using her, not just as bait for the consortium, but as a proxy for all the rage and guilt and self-hatred he had been drowning in for 20 years. She looked like Celeste, therefore she could be Celeste, or at least a version of Celeste he could save this time. It was insane, dangerous, the kind of obsession that destroyed men. He poured the whiskey he had not been drinking into the fire and watched the flames surge blue and hungry. Destruction. Maybe that was what he wanted. Maybe after 2 decades of being the perfect duke, the controlled aristocrat, the man who felt nothing, he finally wanted to burn it all down. Starting with himself. The next morning, Serafina found him in the breakfast room, staring at coffee he would not drink, while the morning paper lay unread beside his plate. She sat across from him with the precise movements of someone performing a familiar dance. Whatever you're planning with that girl, it needs to stop. Her name is Evelyn. I don't care if her name is Helen of Troy. Serafina's voice was cold. You're making a spectacle of yourself. People are talking. Let them talk. Adrian. She leaned forward, and he saw something like desperation in her eyes. I've tolerated this marriage for 18 years. I've accepted that you don't love me, that you never loved me. I've lived in this mausoleum pretending we're a normal couple while you drift through life like a ghost. But this obsession with a girl who looks like your dead lover, it's humiliating me publicly. You've never cared about my opinion before. Why start now? Because before you were discreet. Her composure cracked. You kept your distance. You maintained appearances. Now you're parading her around, bringing her into our home, staring at her like she's the answer to some question only you understand. She shook her head. What do you think will happen when you take her to the Ashford ball? Because yes, I know about that plan. The servants talk. I think the truth will come out. What truth? That your father and his friends were criminals? Serafina's laugh was harsh. Everyone knows that, Adrian. The aristocracy is built on crime and exploitation. Nobody cares. They killed Celeste Arden to keep their secrets. That stopped her. The color drained from her face, and for the first time in years, Adrian saw genuine emotion behind his wife's careful mask. You can't prove that, she said finally. Actually, I can. He pulled out Fairfax's letter and placed it on the table between them. Read it." She did, her hands trembling slightly. When she finished, she looked up at him with something like fear. "If you make this public, it won't just destroy them. It will destroy us, our name, our position, everything." "Good. Let it burn." Serafina stood abruptly. "You're insane." "Probably." He met her gaze without flinching. "But I'm done pretending. I'm done living in a house built on lies and corpses. And if you want to preserve your precious reputation, I suggest you distance yourself from me immediately." She stared at him for a long moment, then walked out without another word. Adrian sat alone in the breakfast room and felt something like relief. For 20 years, he had maintained the fiction of his marriage, his position, his perfect aristocratic life. Now the facade was cracking, and beneath it was only rage and grief and a hunger for truth that felt almost holy in its intensity. He was going to destroy everything, and he was going to enjoy it. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange blur of preparation and tension. Adrian hired additional guards for the estate, men loyal to him rather than the family name. He had his investigator dig deeper into the consortium, looking for any connection between Lord Fairfax, Viscount Ashford, and other potential conspirators. And he spent time with Evelyn, not deliberately, or at least that was what he told himself, but somehow they kept ending up in the same rooms. The library late at night, when she could not sleep and he would not. The gardens in the afternoon, where she walked to clear her head and he walked to watch her. The portrait gallery, where she stared at paintings of Blackthorn ancestors and he stared at her staring. "You're making people uncomfortable," she said one evening as they stood before Celeste's portrait. "The staff thinks you've gone mad." "Have I?" She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and he saw intelligence and wariness in equal measure. "I think you're a man who's been dead for 20 years and is only now remembering how to feel. That's not madness, but it might be just as dangerous." "What do you feel when you look at her?" He gestured to the portrait. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "Like I'm looking at someone I should remember but don't. Like there's a story I'm supposed to know but can only hear pieces of." She paused. "Like I'm haunted by a ghost who has my face." "She was brave," Adrian said quietly. "Braver than I was. She saw corruption and decided to fight it, even knowing it might kill her. And it did. And now you want me to walk in her footsteps, wear her face, finish what she started. Yes. What if I'm not brave?" Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. "What if I'm just a terrified girl from the slums who got caught up in something she doesn't understand? Then you're already braver than I was at your age." He turned to face her fully. "I had every advantage, title, wealth, power, and I still chose cowardice. You have nothing, and you're still standing here. That's not weakness, Miss Voss. That's survival. And survival is its own kind of strength." She held his gaze, and something passed between them. Not love. Neither of them was capable of that. But recognition. Two damaged people standing in the ruins of other people's crimes, trying to decide if revenge was the same as justice. "I need a dress," she said finally. "If I'm going to a masquerade ball with the most powerful people in England, I'm not doing it in borrowed clothes." Adrian smiled. "Then we'll get you the finest dress London can provide. And a mask that will make them all wonder who you really are." What he did not say. The mask would not matter. The moment she entered that ballroom, everyone would see Celeste Arden's face. And the men who had murdered her would know their secret was no longer safe. The dress arrived 3 days before the ball, delivered in an enormous box by the most exclusive modiste in Mayfair. Evelyn opened it alone in her room and felt her breath catch. It was not what she expected. Not the virginal white or the demure pastels appropriate for a young woman of no station. Instead, it was deep midnight blue that shifted to silver in the light, cut in a style that was both elegant and subtly dangerous. The neckline was lower than anything she had ever worn. The waist was fitted. The skirt fell in heavy silk that whispered against her skin like secrets. There was a note tucked inside, written in Adrian's precise hand. "Ghosts wear white. Your flesh and blood. Let them see the difference." She tried it on and stared at herself in the small mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger, beautiful, haunted, and somehow powerful. Not the orphan who had scrubbed floors for pennies, not the nobody who had accepted invisibility as her birthright. Someone else. Someone who might have been Celeste Arden's daughter. Someone who might actually survive what was coming. The night before the ball, Adrian called Evelyn to his study one final time. When she entered, she found him standing before a locked cabinet, holding a small wooden box. "There's something you need to see." He opened the box carefully, and inside was a leather journal, pages yellowed with age. Celeste's diary. "I found it hidden in the East Tower years ago, but never had the courage to read it." He held it out. "Now I think you should." Evelyn took it with trembling hands. The handwriting inside was elegant, flowing, achingly familiar, even though she had never seen it before. She read late into the night, curled in a chair by the fire, while Adrian sat across from her in silence. And as she read, the pieces finally assembled into a terrible whole. Celeste Arden had not just stumbled onto the consortium by accident. She had been investigating them deliberately, following rumors of illegal trade routes, falsified shipping manifests, and blackmail networks that reached into Parliament itself. She had documented everything: names, dates, evidence, and she had been pregnant. The final entry was dated the day before she died. "I know they're watching me now. Father Blackthorne confronted me today, told me to stop asking questions or face consequences. But how can I stop when I know what they're doing? How can I stay silent while they exploit and destroy people who have no power to fight back? Adrian says I'm being reckless. Maybe I am, but I'd rather be recklessly moral than safely complicit. I've hidden copies of all my evidence. If something happens to me, the truth will come out eventually. It has to. For my child's sake, if nothing else. They deserve to grow up in a world where courage matters more than convenience." Evelyn closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. She had evidence of her crimes. That's why they killed her. Not because she knew, because she could prove it. Adrian nodded slowly. "And if they knew she had a daughter, they would have killed you too. Someone must have hidden you, paid to keep you safe and anonymous." "Who?" "I don't know. But whoever it was loved Celeste enough to protect what remained of her." They sat in silence, the fire burning low, the weight of history pressing down on them both. "Tomorrow night," Adrian said finally, "we walk into that ballroom and we become the nightmare they've been trying to forget for 23 years. Are you ready?" "No." Evelyn's voice was steady despite her fear. "But I'm going anyway." He smiled then, and it was the most honest expression she had ever seen on his face. "Good. Because if we're going to die, we might as well die making them remember what they tried so hard to bury." The day of the masquerade ball arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Evelyn spent the morning in her room, alternating between panic and a strange, cold determination. She had survived 26 years of being nobody. She could survive one night of being everybody's ghost. When the carriage arrived to take them to Ashford Manor, she descended the stairs in her midnight blue gown and mask of silver lace. Adrian waited at the bottom, dressed in severe black, his own mask a simple strip of black silk that somehow made him look more dangerous than any elaborate costume could. Serafina stood in the doorway of the drawing room, watching them both with an expression that might have been pity or contempt or both. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said quietly. Adrian looked at his wife, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in years. "I don't. But I know what I'm not doing. I'm not letting another woman die to protect powerful men's secrets. Then God help you both." The carriage ride took an hour, and they sat in silence for most of it. As they approached the brightly lit manor, its windows blazing with candles and music spilling out into the night, Adrian finally spoke. "If at any point you want to leave, we leave. No questions, no judgment. And if I want to stay until the end, then I'll be standing beside you." The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. Adrian stepped out first, then offered his hand to help Evelyn descend. She took it and felt the world tilt. Not from fear, not from uncertainty, from the sudden, absolute knowledge that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. She was about to walk into a room full of England's most powerful people, wearing a dead woman's face and carrying her secrets. She was about to become visible in a way that could not be undone. She was about to stop surviving and start fighting. Adrian felt her hand tighten on his, felt her entire body steel itself for what came next. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She lifted her chin, and in that gesture he saw exactly what Celeste must have looked like the night she decided truth mattered more than safety. "Let's make them remember," Evelyn said. And together they walked through the doors of Ashford Manor into a ballroom that fell absolutely silent the moment Evelyn's face became visible beneath her mask. Because every person there over the age of 40 knew exactly who they were looking at. And somewhere in that crowd, at least one person knew they should have made sure she stayed dead. The silence in the ballroom lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the whispers began, a low, venomous hiss that spread through the crowd like poison through water. Evelyn felt every eye on her, felt the weight of recognition and horror ripple outward from where she stood beside Adrian at the top of the marble stairs. She looks exactly like her. Impossible. Celeste Arden has been dead for over 20 years. Who is that woman? Blackthorn has finally lost his mind. Adrian's hand remained steady on her arm, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic indifference. But Evelyn could feel the tension in his grip, the barely controlled rage that hummed beneath his perfect composure. This was what he wanted, to force the past into the present, to make comfortable people remember what they had spent decades forgetting. Shall we? His voice was low, meant only for her. She nodded, unable to speak, and together they descended into the ballroom. The crowd parted before them like water before a ship, people stepping back instinctively as if proximity to Evelyn might contaminate them with whatever curse had brought a ghost back to life. The orchestra had stopped playing. In the sudden quiet, the sound of Evelyn's footsteps on marble felt obscenely loud. She kept her chin high, her eyes forward, even as her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to hurt. At the far end of the ballroom, standing beside a towering ice sculpture, was Viscount Ashford. 70 years old, silver-haired, distinguished, the kind of man who looked like he should be carved into monuments. He held a glass of champagne that had stopped halfway to his lips the moment Evelyn entered. Their eyes met across the room and Evelyn saw it. Recognition, shock, and beneath it all something that looked almost like fear. Adrian guided her forward with deliberate slowness, giving everyone time to stare, to remember, to wonder. They passed clusters of gossiping aristocrats who fell silent as they approached, then erupted into frantic whispers the moment they passed. A woman in an elaborate peacock mask grabbed Evelyn's arm. "Are you some kind of parlor trick? A cruel joke?" Evelyn pulled free without answering, but the woman's words followed her. "This is ghoulish. Whoever put you up to this should be ashamed." They reached Viscount Ashford, who had recovered enough composure to arrange his features into something resembling pleasant confusion. His eyes stayed sharp and calculating. "Blackthorn. What an unexpected surprise." The Viscount's gaze slid to Evelyn. "And you've brought a guest. How delightful. Though I must say the resemblance is quite disturbing." Adrian's voice was silk over steel. "Yes, I imagine it must be, especially for anyone who knew Celeste Arden personally." Ashford's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind his eyes. A tragedy, her death. Such a young woman. Such a terrible accident. Was it? Evelyn spoke for the first time since entering the ballroom, and her voice carried further than she intended. The conversations around them stuttered to silence. Or was it something else? The Viscount looked at her as if she were a talking dog, mildly amusing but fundamentally inappropriate. "I'm afraid I don't understand the question, my dear, though I must ask, who are you exactly? My name is Evelyn Voss, and I think you know exactly who I am." For just a moment, Ashford's mask slipped. His eyes went cold, predatory. Then the pleasant confusion returned. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. I've never seen you before in my life. But you've seen my mother." The words dropped into the ballroom like stones into still water. Around them, people stopped even pretending not to listen. This was scandal unfolding in real time, the kind of moment that would be dissected in drawing rooms for months. Ashford laughed, but it sounded hollow. "My dear girl, I have no idea what delusion you're operating under, but I assure you—" Adrian pulled out a folded paper from inside his jacket and handed it to the Viscount. "Then perhaps this will refresh your memory. It's a letter from Lord Fairfax to my father, dated 3 days before Celeste Arden's murder. Not an accident. Murder." The word hung in the air like smoke. Ashford's hand shook slightly as he took the letter. He read it once, his face draining of color, then looked up at Adrian with something close to hatred. "This proves nothing. It's ancient history. The ravings of dead men. It proves you were involved in a conspiracy that ended with a young woman being pushed from a tower." Adrian's voice was low but carried absolute conviction. "And it suggests you had motive, means, and opportunity. You're insane." Ashford crumpled the letter and dropped it. Whatever guilt drives you to these fantasies, Blackthorn, don't drag innocent people into your madness. Innocent? Evelyn's voice shook with rage. You murdered a woman who was pregnant with her first child. You erased her from existence and tried to erase me. Where exactly is the innocence in that? Prove it. Ashford's smile was vicious. Bring me actual evidence or stop wasting everyone's time with theatrical accusations. That was when the first scream came from the entrance hall. Everyone turned as a commotion erupted near the doors. Shouts, the sound of something heavy hitting marble. Then a woman's voice, high and panicked. There's been an attack! Someone call a physician! Adrian was moving before conscious thought, pulling Evelyn with him as they pushed through the crowd toward the entrance. People pressed back, their earlier curiosity turning to genuine fear. In the entrance hall, a man lay crumpled on the floor, blood spreading across the white marble in a dark pool. He was older, perhaps 60, dressed in evening clothes now torn and stained. A knife handle protruded from between his ribs, and standing over him, her hands covered in blood, was Seraphina Blackthorn. Adrian froze. His wife looked up, saw him, and something broke in her expression, a dam of control finally shattering after years of holding back floodwaters. He was coming for her. Seraphina's voice was hollow, distant. He had a knife. He was going to finish what they started 23 years ago. Who is he? Adrian knelt beside the dying man, pressing his hands against the wound even though he could see it was already too late. The man's eyes focused on Adrian with effort. His lips moved, forming words that came out as wet whispers. Had to. No choice. They have my daughter. Who has your daughter? Adrian leaned closer. Who gave the order? But the man's eyes went glassy, his final breath rattling out in a sigh that sounded almost like relief. Adrian sat back on his heels, his hands covered in a stranger's blood, his mind trying to process what had just happened. Behind him, the ballroom crowd pressed forward, some horrified, some merely curious. The aristocracy had always loved a good spectacle, especially when it involved violence and scandal. Seraphina swayed on her feet. Mrs. Fairweather, the hostess, caught her before she fell. Someone bring water! Brandy! The Duchess is in shock! But Seraphina pulled away, her eyes locked on Adrian. I heard him talking to someone in the garden. He said the girl had to die tonight, that the evidence she carried was too dangerous. So I followed him. And when he came inside with a knife, she looked down at her bloody hands. I didn't think. I just acted. Evelyn moved to Adrian's side, staring down at the corpse. Do you know who he is? Adrian nodded slowly, his stomach turning. Lord Edmund Cartwright. He's been on the board of the East India Trading Company for 30 years. He was a friend of my father's. He paused, the implications assembling into something terrible. He was part of the consortium. Then he was one of the men who killed my mother. And now he's dead. Adrian stood, his mind racing, which means we have no testimony, no confession, just a corpse and accusations we can't prove. But we have witnesses. Evelyn gestured to the crowd. Everyone heard what he said. About someone having his daughter, about orders being given. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. In the cold light of actual violence, their appetite for scandal was waning. Murder was entertaining when it was historical and distant. Fresh blood on marble was something else entirely. Adrian looked around the ballroom, studying faces. Ashford had disappeared, slipped away in the chaos, probably. Others were already edging toward exits, eager to distance themselves from whatever disaster was unfolding. And that was when he saw him. Standing near the orchestra platform, watching everything with cold calculation, was a man Adrian had not seen in 7 years. Tall, thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the bland face of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated. Theodore Graves, his own steward. The man who had served his family for 40 years. The man who had helped him search for Evelyn. The man who knew every secret the Blackthorn household contained. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Adrian saw the truth written in that brief exchange. Not shock, not confusion, just the calm acknowledgement of someone whose careful plans had suddenly collapsed. Graves had been there all along, watching, reporting, making sure the consortium knew exactly what Adrian was investigating and how close he was getting to the truth. The betrayal hit Adrian like a physical blow. Not because he had trusted Graves, trust was a luxury Adrian had stopped affording anyone years ago, but because he had been so focused on external enemies that he had never considered the one living under his own roof. Graves turned and walked calmly toward a side exit. No hurry, no panic, just the steady departure of a man who knew exactly when to abandon a sinking ship. "Stop him!" Adrian's voice cut through the chaos, but by the time anyone moved, Graves had disappeared through a servant's entrance, melting into the manor's labyrinthine back corridors where he would know every escape route. Adrian started after him, but Evelyn grabbed his arm. "Let him go. He's been working for them this entire time. Everything we've done, every piece of evidence we've found, has already been copied and hidden." "You think I trusted anyone in that house?" Evelyn's voice was hard. "I gave Graves false information about where I kept Celeste's diary. Real evidence is somewhere he could never find it." Adrian stared at her, seeing for the first time how thoroughly she had learned to survive in a world designed to destroy her. Where? Somewhere safe. Somewhere that if anything happens to either of us, it will still come to light. She smiled grimly. "I'm nobody's victim anymore, Your Grace. And I'm certainly not stupid enough to put all my cards on the table when playing against men who murder to protect their secrets." Behind them, constables were arriving. Someone had sent for the police. Mrs. Fairweather was trying to maintain order, directing guests to provide statements, her social hostess instincts taking over even in crisis. Serafina sat on a bench staring at her bloody hands. A physician was examining her for injury, but finding none. The blood was all Cartwright's. Adrian moved to his wife's side and knelt down. Serafina looked at him with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated pain. "You were right," she said quietly. "This house is built on corpses, and I've been living in it, pretending not to notice the smell." Her voice broke. "I couldn't let them kill her, Adrian. I couldn't watch it happen again." "Again?" When his wife didn't answer, Adrian felt ice slide through his veins. "Serafina, what do you mean? Again?" She closed her eyes. "I was there the night Celeste died. I saw them push her." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Adrian gripped the edge of the bench to keep from falling. "You were there. Your father made me watch." Serafina's voice was toneless, dead. "He wanted me to understand what happened to women who asked too many questions, who threatened powerful men. It was meant to be a lesson, about knowing my place, about staying silent. And you never said anything. Who would I tell? The men who murdered her? The society that worshipped them?" Her laugh was broken glass. "I was 20 years old, Adrian. I had no power, no voice, no one who would have believed me even if I'd been brave enough to try." Adrian felt something crack inside him, not just anger at the conspiracy, but rage at the entire system that had created it. The world that taught women they were powerless, that rewarded silence and punished truth, that ground people into dust and called it civilization. Who else was there? His voice was barely a whisper. That night, who pushed her? Serafina opened her eyes and looked at him with terrible honesty. "Your father, Lord Fairfax, Viscount Ashford, and one other man." She paused. "The Archbishop of Canterbury." The name hung in the air like poison. The Archbishop, one of the most powerful religious figures in England, a man above reproach, beyond suspicion. If he was involved, then the conspiracy reached higher than Adrian had imagined, into the church, into the government, into every institution that claimed moral authority. "He's dead now," Serafina continued. "Died 3 years ago. Natural causes, they said. But who knows what's natural when men like that are involved?" Adrian stood, his mind churning. 4 conspirators, 2 dead from old age, 1 just murdered, and Ashford, still alive, still free, probably already arranging his next move. "We need to leave." Evelyn appeared at his side, her voice urgent. "The constables are going to want statements, and Ashford has had time to spin whatever story he wants." "Let him try." Adrian's voice was hollow. "We have Serafina's testimony now, an eyewitness to murder. Do you really think they'll let her testify?" Evelyn's eyes were hard. "A duchess who just killed a man, claiming she witnessed a decades-old murder? They'll call her insane. They'll lock her away in an asylum before she can ever see a courtroom." "She's right." Serafina stood shakily. "I've given you what truth I can. But I won't be used as a weapon in your war, Adrian. I've spent 20 years being someone's tool. Never again. Then what will you do? Leave. Tonight. I have family in Scotland who will take me in. She looked at her husband with something like pity. You wanted me to be free of this marriage, Adrian. Consider me freed. She walked away without looking back, escorted by Mrs. Fairweather toward a private room where she could clean the blood from her hands before the constables asked their questions. Adrian watched her go and felt the last piece of his old life crumble. His wife, his steward, his family name, everything that had once defined him was disintegrating. And what remained was only rage and a hungry need for justice that felt more like vengeance with each passing moment. A constable approached, young and nervous. Your Grace, I need to ask you some questions about... Not now. Adrian's voice carried absolute authority, the kind of command that aristocrats were trained to use from birth. Speak with my solicitor tomorrow. Right now, I need to ensure Miss Voss's safety. But, Your Grace, there's been a murder. Self-defense. Multiple witnesses saw Lord Cartwright attack the Duchess. Unless you're planning to arrest a woman for protecting herself from a knife-wielding assailant? The constable hesitated, clearly out of his depth when dealing with dukes and duchesses and ballrooms full of the most powerful people in England. I'll need to speak with Lady Blackthorne at least. She's in shock. Give her the night to recover. Adrian moved past him, taking Evelyn's arm. We're leaving. They pushed through the crowd toward the exit. Behind them, the ballroom had descended into chaos, constables trying to maintain order, guests providing contradictory accounts, servants attempting to clean blood from marble floors. Outside, their carriage was waiting. Adrian helped Evelyn inside, then climbed in after her. The moment the door closed, cutting them off from the madness, Evelyn broke. Not tears, something worse. Her entire body shook with suppressed rage and horror, her hands clenching into fists hard enough that her nails drew blood from her palms. We walked in there like it was a game, like we could control what happened. Evelyn's voice was raw. And instead, a man died. Your wife became a killer, and we're no closer to justice than we were before. We know Ashford is guilty. We have Seraphina's testimony, which we can never use. Don't you understand? Everything we've done has only made it worse. She looked at him with eyes that reflected every cruel lesson she had learned. You wanted to save me, to protect me like you couldn't protect Celeste, but all you've done is paint a target on my back and given them more reason to want me dead. Then what do you suggest we do? Adrian's control was fracturing. Run? Hide? Let them win? I suggest we stop pretending we're heroes in some story where justice triumphs. Evelyn's laugh was bitter. We're not heroes. We're just two people who were stupid enough to think truth mattered more than power. The carriage rumbled through London streets, taking them back toward Blackthorn Hall. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence was heavy with everything unsaid, all the ways they had failed, all the ways they had underestimated the enemy, all the ways they were still dangerously unprepared for what came next. Finally, Adrian spoke. Celeste's diary, the real one. Where is it? Evelyn met his gaze steadily. Safe. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting, because if they torture it out of you, I need to know it's still hidden. The casual mention of torture should have seemed melodramatic. Instead, it felt grimly realistic. These were men who had murdered to protect their secrets. They would not stop at interrogation. When they reached Blackthorn Hall, the estate looked different somehow. Less imposing, more like a prison. Every window was dark except for a few scattered lights in the servants' quarters. The place felt abandoned, as if everyone with sense had already fled. Inside, Mrs. Hendricks met them in the entrance hall, wringing her hands. Your Grace, I heard about what happened. Is the Duchess... She's fine. She's staying elsewhere for a while. Adrian removed his coat, his movements mechanical. Send word to the staff. Anyone who wishes to seek other employment will receive excellent references and 3 months' severance. I expect there will be many who want to leave. Mrs. Hendricks nodded, understanding perfectly. A house touched by murder and scandal was not a place servants wanted to remain. And Your Grace? What about you? I'm staying. Until this is finished, I'm staying. After Mrs. Hendricks left, Adrian and Evelyn stood alone in the vast entrance hall. The portraits of Blackthorn ancestors glared down at them, Generations of men and women who had built their power on secrets and compromises and carefully maintained silence. I need to tell you something. Evelyn's voice was quiet. About Graves. What about him? I knew he was feeding information to someone. I've known for days. She met Adrian's shocked stare without flinching. I gave him exactly what I wanted him to report, including where we would be tonight, and exactly what accusations we would make. You used him. Adrian felt something close to admiration. You manipulated my own steward. I manipulated everyone, including you. Evelyn's expression was hard. You think I came here as some innocent victim? I came here because I needed resources to uncover the truth about who I am. You were convenient. Your obsession with my face was a tool I could use. The honesty was like a slap. Adrian stared at this young woman who looked like Celeste, but thought like someone who had learned survival in the cruelest schools. So everything between us was strategic. Yes. Her voice softened slightly. Until it wasn't. Until I started to understand that you're just as much a victim as I am. Just a different kind of prison. They stood in the silence of the entrance hall, two people who had used each other and saved each other in equal measure, and neither knew what came next. That was when the explosion came. Not from inside the hall, from the east wing. A deafening boom that shook the entire structure, followed by the sound of stone crumbling and glass shattering. Flames erupted from windows that had been dark moments before, bright orange against the night sky. Adrian ran toward the source, Evelyn close behind. Servants poured into the halls, screaming, confused. Smoke filled the corridors, thick and choking. The East Tower. The words came out as a gasp. They're destroying the East Tower, where Celeste died, where any remaining evidence might still be hidden. They reached the base of the tower to find the staircase blocked by fallen debris, flames climbing the walls with hungry speed. The heat was intense enough to force them back. Adrian stared at the inferno consuming the last place Celeste Arden had stood alive, and something inside him finally shattered completely. Not his control, that had been cracking for weeks. Something deeper, the last pretense that he could win this fight by staying within the rules. They're erasing everything. His voice was hollow. Every piece of evidence, every trace of what happened. They're burning it all. Not everything. Evelyn pulled a small key from inside her dress. Celeste was smart. She knew they might destroy the tower. So she hid copies elsewhere. Where? The one place no one would think to look. The church crypt beneath Blackthorn Family Cemetery, where all your ancestors are buried. She held up the key, including the ones who were murdered. Adrian looked at her. This woman who had played him, used him, and somehow saved him all at once, and made a decision that would either redeem him or damn him permanently. Then we go there. Tonight. We get the evidence and we don't stop until every single person responsible is exposed. No more half measures, no more playing by rules they don't follow. They'll kill us. Probably. His smile was grim and feral, but we'll make sure the truth survives us. Behind them, Blackthorn Hall burned. Servants fled into the night. The East Tower collapsed in a shower of sparks and ash. And somewhere in London, Viscount Ashford was probably celebrating what he thought was the end of a threat. He had no idea that the real threat was just beginning, because Adrian Blackthorn had spent 20 years being careful, being controlled, being the perfect duke who colored inside every line society drew. And now, standing in the ruins of everything he had pretended to be, he discovered what he actually was beneath all that careful construction. Not a hero, not even particularly good, just a man who had finally learned that sometimes justice required becoming exactly as ruthless as the monsters you fought. And if that meant burning down the entire aristocratic system to expose its rotten foundation, then he would strike the match himself and watch it all turn to ash. The cemetery lay 3 miles from Blackthorn Hall, far enough that the glow of the burning tower faded behind them as they rode through the darkness. Adrian pushed the horses harder than was safe, the carriage lurching over rutted roads while Evelyn braced herself against the seat, the small brass key clutched in her fist like a talisman. Neither spoke. Words felt inadequate for what they were racing toward, not just evidence, but the final accounting of everything that had been stolen from them. Every year of silence, every life destroyed to protect powerful men's secrets, every moment of grief that could have been prevented if someone had been brave enough to speak 23 years ago. The horse's hooves pounded against packed earth in a rhythm that matched Adrian's heartbeat. He had spent 2 decades moving through life with the careful precision of a man afraid to disturb anything, afraid that one wrong step would bring the entire fragile structure of his existence crashing down. Now the structure was already rubble and ash behind him, and all that remained was forward momentum. Keep moving or die. Fight or surrender. There was no middle ground left. That was what happened when you finally stopped pretending you had something to lose. You discovered what you were actually capable of when survival became the only law that mattered. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, iron and stone silhouetted against the night sky. Adrian pulled the carriage to a stop and climbed down, his legs unsteady from adrenaline and exhaustion. Behind him, Evelyn descended without waiting for assistance, her midnight blue gown torn and stained with soot, her hair falling loose from its pins. She looked like a warrior queen returning from battle, nothing like the timid seamstress who had arrived at his estate weeks ago. The gates were locked, but Adrian had keys, one of the few privileges of being the family whose dead filled most of the plots. He opened them with hands that shook slightly, then led Evelyn through rows of weathered headstones toward the family mausoleum at the far end. His ancestors watched from their marble monuments, generations of Blackthorns who had built their power through conquest and commerce and calculated marriages. Men who had believed they were creating something that would last forever, never imagining that the whole empire might collapse because one woman asked the wrong questions. The mausoleum entrance was a heavy stone door carved with the family crest, a thorned rose wrapped around a sword. Adrian had always thought it looked noble. Now it just looked like what it was, violence dressed up as honor. The door opened with a groan of protesting hinges. Inside, the air was cold and stale, smelling of old stone and older death. Evelyn produced a small lantern from the carriage supplies and lit it, the flame casting dancing shadows across stone coffins and memorial plaques. "Where?" Adrian's voice echoed in the confined space. Evelyn moved to a coffin near the back, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. The nameplate read, Eleanor Blackthorn, died 1789. She ran her fingers along the edge until she found a hidden latch. The top of the coffin swung open on concealed hinges, revealing not a body but a hollow compartment. Inside was a leather document case, sealed with wax that had somehow survived decades of temperature changes and neglect. "Celeste knew your family history." Evelyn's voice was quiet. She knew about Eleanor Blackthorn, the one who was supposedly mad, locked away for asking too many questions about her husband's business dealings, the one who died under suspicious circumstances. She lifted the case out carefully. "Your family has been silencing inconvenient women for over a century, Your Grace. Celeste just made sure this particular woman's voice would survive her death." Adrian took the case with hands that felt numb. The weight of it was substantial. Years of investigation, documentation, proof. Everything Celeste had died trying to protect. He broke the seal and opened it. Inside were journals, shipping manifests, correspondence between his father and other members of the consortium, financial records showing illegal trade routes, falsified customs documents, bribes paid to officials from London to Bombay, and photographs, grainy but clear enough, showing warehouses full of goods that should never have entered England. Opium, weapons, human cargo. The consortium had not just been corrupt, they had been trafficking in every form of misery that generated profit. And they had killed Celeste Arden because she had compiled evidence that could have sent every one of them to prison for life. Adrian sank down onto the edge of Eleanor Blackthorn's empty coffin, the documents scattered across his lap. He felt sick. Not surprised, he had known his father was capable of evil, but seeing the scale of it, the systematic cruelty, the way they had turned human suffering into ledger entries and profit margins. "This is what I protected." His voice was barely a whisper. "When I stayed silent about Celeste's death, this is what I let continue." "You were 22 years old and terrified." Evelyn knelt beside him. "You were a victim too, just a different kind. That's not an excuse." "No, it's not. But it's context." She gestured to the documents. "And now you have a choice. You can let guilt destroy you, or you can use it as fuel to burn down everyone responsible." Adrian looked at her, this woman who had every reason to hate him, to blame him, to walk away, and let him drown in the consequences of his family's crimes. Instead, she was offering him a path forward. Not redemption. There was no redemption for what he had allowed, but purpose. The kind of purpose that came from finally choosing to fight instead of hide. He stood, gathering the documents. We take this to the newspapers. Every major publication in London. We make copies and distribute them so widely they can't suppress them all. They'll try to kill us before we can. Let them try. Adrian's voice was steel. I'm done being afraid. They work quickly, sorting through the documents and dividing them into multiple sets. Evidence of illegal trade, proof of bribery, testimony from victims who had been silenced or disappeared, names of every conspirator, not just Ashford and the dead men, but others who were still alive, still powerful, still believing themselves untouchable. And then at the bottom of the case, Adrian found something that made his blood freeze. A birth certificate, dated 26 years ago. Mother, Celeste Arden. Father, Adrian Blackthorne. Child, Eleanor Celeste Blackthorne. He stared at it, his vision blurring. Evelyn moved to his side and looked over his shoulder, her sharp intake of breath confirming what he was seeing. She named me after the woman in that coffin. Evelyn's voice shook, after the woman who was silenced for asking questions. You're my daughter. The words felt surreal, even as he spoke them. All this time I've been fighting to uncover my own father. Her laugh was broken. That's almost funny, in the cruelest possible way. Adrian turned to face her, seeing her features in a new light. Not just Celeste's reflection, but his own. The sharp line of her jaw. The way she held herself when angry. The stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had driven him for weeks and apparently lived in her blood. I didn't know. You have to believe I didn't know. I know. Evelyn wiped at her eyes furiously. If you'd known, you wouldn't have been obsessed with my face. You would have been protecting me. They stood in the mausoleum surrounded by evidence of their family's crimes, surrounded by the bones of ancestors who had built an empire on suffering, and the enormity of what they had uncovered pressed down like a physical weight. This changes nothing. Adrian's voice was firm. We still expose them. We still fight. It changes everything. Evelyn met his gaze. Because now when they kill us, they'll be murdering a father and daughter. That's a story that will spread. That's the kind of tragedy people remember. Then we make sure we're not easy to kill. They loaded the documents back into the case and returned to the carriage. Dawn was beginning to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. Adrian drove them not back toward Blackthorn Hall, but toward London, toward Fleet Street, where the newspapers lived, where truth could be printed and distributed before anyone could stop it. But as they approached the outskirts of the city, Evelyn grabbed his arm. Stop! What? Someone's following us. Adrian glanced back and saw it. A dark carriage perhaps a quarter-mile behind, matching their pace exactly. His stomach dropped. They had been found. He snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. The carriage behind them accelerated as well, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Ahead, the streets were still mostly empty, dawn on a Sunday when even London rested. They're going to force us off the road. Evelyn's voice was steady despite the fear. They can't let us reach the newspapers. Hold on. Adrian pulled the carriage into a sharp turn down a narrow street between warehouses. The wheels skidded on loose cobblestones, the whole vehicle tilting dangerously before righting itself. Behind them, the pursuing carriage followed without hesitation. The street dead-ended at the river. Adrian had no choice but to stop. He grabbed the document case and climbed down, Evelyn right behind him. The pursuing carriage pulled up 20 yards away, blocking their only exit. 4 men climbed out. Not hired thugs. These were professionals. Military bearing. Weapons concealed but visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Men who had probably killed before and would kill again without hesitation. And stepping out last, moving with the careful dignity of a man who believed himself untouchable, was Viscount Ashford. He looked older in this dawn light, the veneer of distinguished aristocrat cracking to reveal something reptilian beneath. His eyes fixed on the document case in Adrian's hands. You've caused quite a bit of trouble, Blackthorne. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. I'll admit, I didn't expect you to get this far. Most men would have given up after the tower burned. Most men didn't have their entire lives destroyed by your conspiracy. Conspiracy. Ashford smiled. Such a dramatic word. We were businessmen pursuing profit in a world that made profit difficult through inconvenient regulations. Nothing more sinister than that. You trafficked in human misery. Adrian's voice was cold. Opium. Weapons to war zones. You literally bought and sold people. The empire was built on such transactions. Ashford shrugged. We simply continued a proud tradition, and we would have continued for decades more if that foolish girl hadn't decided to play investigator. That foolish girl was my... Adrian caught himself, realizing the truth was a weapon he needed to deploy carefully. She was someone who believed truth mattered more than profit. Novel concept, I know. And it got her killed. Just as your misguided sense of justice is about to get you killed. Ashford gestured to his men. The case, Blackthorn. Hand it over and I'll make this quick. Painless, even. As a courtesy to your family name. The family name is worthless. Adrian held the case tighter. Built on crimes I was too cowardly to expose. But I'm not that coward anymore. Then you're a fool. Ashford's patience was wearing thin. You think you can win this? You think one duke with a bastard daughter and some old documents can bring down an entire network of the most powerful men in England? Yes. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. Because you're old, you're arrogant, and you think you're invincible because you've been getting away with murder for decades. But every empire falls eventually, and yours is about to collapse. Ashford looked at her with the cold assessment of a man evaluating livestock. You look just like her, you know. Celeste. Same defiant eyes. Same foolish courage. He paused. She screamed when she fell. Did you know that? Tried to grab the windowsill, but her hands were too weak. Gravity did most of the work. Adrian moved before conscious thought, lunging forward with fists clenched. But two of Ashford's men intercepted him, grabbing his arms and slamming him back against the carriage hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. You want to fight? Ashford's smile widened. How refreshingly primitive. Though I suppose when you have no legal recourse, violence is all that remains. One of the men holding Adrian pulled out a knife, the blade catching the dawn light. Adrian struggled, but the grip on his arms was iron. This was how it ended, murdered in an alley by the river while Ashford stood watching with the detached interest of a man observing an insect being crushed. Wait. Evelyn's voice cut through the moment. I'll give you the case. No! Adrian's shout was desperate. But Evelyn was already moving toward Ashford, the document case held out in front of her like an offering. Her face was calm, resigned, the face of someone who had decided exactly what sacrifice was worth making. Smart girl. Ashford reached for the case, and Evelyn hurled it into the river. For a single frozen moment, everyone watched the leather case arc through the air and hit the water with a splash. It floated for perhaps 3 seconds before the weight of the documents inside pulled it under, disappearing into the dark current. Ashford's composure shattered. He lunged for the riverbank, but it was already too late. The Thames had swallowed decades of evidence, pulling it down into depths where it would be scattered and destroyed long before anyone could recover it. You stupid, stupid child! Ashford whirled on Evelyn, his face purple with rage. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Ensured you can never destroy it. Evelyn's smile was fierce. Those documents are in the river, yes. But I made copies, multiple copies. And if we don't walk away from here right now, those copies will be delivered to every newspaper in London within the hour. You're bluffing. Try me. She stepped closer, fearless in the face of his rage. You've spent 23 years believing you're untouchable, that your power and your money and your connections make you immune to consequences. But I've spent 26 years learning how to survive when I have nothing. And surviving means always having a backup plan. Ashford stared at her, trying to gauge if she was lying. Adrian could see the calculation happening behind the Viscount's eyes. Risk versus reward, certainty versus doubt. Let them go. The command came from one of Ashford's men, the one who looked most military. If she's telling the truth and we kill them, we guarantee exposure. If we let them live, we have time to locate the copies before they're distributed. She's lying. But Ashford's voice lacked conviction. Maybe. The man released Adrian's arm. But are you willing to bet everything on that assumption? The moment stretched taut. Adrian could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the cold sweat running down his spine. This was the pivot point, The instant where everything would either collapse into violence or somehow, miraculously, stay balanced long enough for them to escape. Ashford stepped back. "You have 1 hour. After that, I will hunt down you, your copies, and anyone who has even looked at those documents. And I will bury you so deep that in 100 years no one will remember you ever existed. We'll see." Adrian moved to Evelyn's side, and together they walked past Ashford and his men toward the narrow street beyond. Every step felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Every moment, Adrian expected to hear the sound of a pistol being cocked, the moment before everything ended. But they made it to the street, made it around the corner, made it far enough that the warehouse blocked them from view. Then they ran, through empty streets that were just beginning to wake, past startled merchants opening shops, through alleys that reeked of waste and desperation. They ran until Adrian's lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, until Evelyn stumbled and he caught her, both of them gasping for breath in the doorway of a closed bakery. "The copies." Adrian could barely speak. "Please tell me you actually made copies." Evelyn looked at him with eyes that held exhaustion and grim humor in equal measure. "Of course I made copies. What kind of fool do you think I am? Where are they?" 3 different locations. One with a solicitor who has instructions to deliver them if I don't check in by noon. One hidden in a boarding house in Whitechapel where I still pay rent. And one, she paused, one I gave to your wife 3 days ago. Serafina has copies. She's the only person I knew who had both the resources to keep them hidden and the motivation to use them if we died. Evelyn straightened, still breathing hard. "Your wife might hate you, Adrian, but she hates the men who made her watch a murder even more." Adrian felt something crack in his chest, not breaking, but opening. This woman, his daughter, had outmaneuvered every enemy they faced while he had been focused on his guilt and his obsession. She had learned to survive in a world designed to crush her, and she had done it by being smarter, more ruthless, and more strategic than anyone expected. She was extraordinary. "We need to reach the solicitor before noon." Adrian checked his pocket watch. They had 40 minutes. "If Ashford realizes you're not bluffing, he'll go after all the copies simultaneously. Then we move fast." They ran again, this time with destination and purpose. Through London's waking streets, past carts delivering goods, past workers heading to factories, past the machinery of empire grinding forward with no idea that somewhere in its gears, 2 people were trying to jam the whole system to a halt. The solicitor's office was in a respectable neighborhood near Lincoln's Inn. They arrived with 5 minutes to spare, both of them looking like refugees from a catastrophe, which, in a sense, they were. The solicitor, a thin man named Pemberton with wire-rimmed spectacles and the nervous disposition of someone who had seen too many cases go wrong, looked up as they burst through his door. "Miss Voss, Your Grace." His eyes widened at their appearance. "What happened?" "Change of plans." Evelyn was already moving to his desk. "The documents I left with you, I need them delivered immediately. Every newspaper in London, the Times, the Telegraph, the Evening Standard, all of them. But you said only if you didn't check in by—" "Plans changed." She leaned over the desk. "Do it now, or we're all dead by sunset." Pemberton looked to Adrian for confirmation. Adrian nodded. "Do exactly as she says. Bill my estate for any costs." The solicitor opened a locked drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside would be copies of everything: the manifests, the correspondence, the photographs, evidence that would end careers, destroy reputations, and quite possibly trigger a scandal that reached the highest levels of government. "I'll need at least 2 hours to have them delivered to—" "You have 1 hour." Adrian's voice left no room for negotiation. "After that, the men who want these documents buried will be coming for them, and they won't be polite about it." Pemberton paled but nodded. "I'll hire runners immediately." As the solicitor rushed out to make arrangements, Adrian and Evelyn collapsed into chairs in his office. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion so profound it felt like being underwater. "We did it." Evelyn's voice was distant. "We actually did it. We survived the first part." Adrian's realism tempered her relief. "Now we wait to see if the truth is enough to protect us. And if it's not, then we die knowing we tried." Which is more than most people can say. They sat in silence, listening to the sounds of London beyond the window. Carriages. Voices. The endless churn of a city too busy to notice that somewhere in its depths, two people had just lit a fuse that would blow apart the comfortable lies of the powerful. An hour later, Pemberton returned, looking harried but triumphant. It's done. Runners have been dispatched to every major newspaper. By this afternoon, copies of those documents will be on the desks of every editor in the city. Adrian felt relief so intense it was almost painful. Then we wait. For what? For them to decide if truth matters more than protecting powerful men. The answer came faster than expected. By evening, the first newspaper hit the streets. An extra edition of the Evening Standard with a headline that would be remembered for generations. Aristocratic conspiracy exposed, decades of illegal trade, murder, cover-up. The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, every newspaper in London was running versions of the story, each trying to outdo the others with revelations pulled from Celeste's documents. Names were named, crimes were detailed. The evidence was so overwhelming, so meticulously documented, that even the most establishment-friendly publications could not ignore it. By midnight, angry crowds had gathered outside Viscount Ashford's London residence. By dawn the next day, Parliament had announced a full investigation. By the afternoon, arrest warrants had been issued for multiple members of the consortium. And through it all, Adrian and Evelyn stayed hidden in a small hotel room Pemberton had secured for them, watching their truth reshape the world beyond the windows. She would be proud of you, Adrian said quietly as they watched the latest newspaper being hawked in the street below. Celeste. She died trying to expose these men, and you finished what she started. We finished it, Evelyn corrected. And maybe, her voice was hesitant, maybe we can figure out what being father and daughter means when we're not running for our lives. Adrian looked at this remarkable woman who carried his blood and Celeste's courage, and for the first time in 23 years, he felt something close to hope. But the moment shattered as the door to their room crashed open. Ashford stood there, no longer the dignified Viscount, but something feral and desperate. In his hand was a pistol, trembling with rage and decades of entitlement finally meeting its limit. You destroyed everything. His voice was raw. My reputation, my legacy, everything I built. You destroyed yourself. Adrian moved in front of Evelyn instinctively. We just made sure people knew about it, and now I'm going to make sure you don't live to see the trial. The pistol rose, steadying. Adrian saw Ashford's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the calculation in the old man's eyes. Murder-suicide, probably. Kill them both and then himself. At least deny them the satisfaction of seeing him hang. Time seemed to slow. Adrian's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. He could try to rush Ashford, but the distance was too great. He could shield Evelyn, but the bullet would still find one of them. He could beg, but that would only satisfy the Viscount's sadism. So instead, he did the only thing that made sense in a moment when nothing made sense. He looked Ashford in the eye and smiled. Do it. Kill me. But know that every newspaper in England has my written testimony. Know that my death will only make the story spread faster. Know that you'll be remembered not as a powerful man, but as a murderer and coward who couldn't face the consequences of his own crimes. Ashford's hand shook harder. You think you've won. But even if I hang, there are others. The consortium runs deeper than you can imagine. You've cut off one head, but 3 more will grow back. Then we'll cut those off too. The voice came from behind Ashford. The old man spun, and there stood Seraphina, still wearing the traveling clothes she had fled in days earlier. But her eyes held something new. Not fear, not resignation, but fierce determination. And in her hand was a pistol of her own, aimed steadily at Ashford's chest. I've spent 20 years being silent. Her voice was cold. I've spent 20 years living with the memory of watching you push a pregnant woman from a tower. 20 years of nightmares. 20 years of hating myself for not speaking. She stepped closer. It ends tonight. Ashford tried to turn his weapon toward her, but Seraphina fired first. The shot echoed in the small room, impossibly loud. Ashford staggered back, his own pistol dropping from nerveless fingers. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest with an expression of pure disbelief. Impossible. The word came out as a whisper. You're just a woman. I'm a witness. Seraphina lowered her weapon. And I just made sure you'll never hurt anyone again. Ashford collapsed, his breath coming in wet gasps. Adrian moved to his side, not out of compassion, but to hear if there were any final words, any last confession or revelation. The old man's eyes found Adrian's face. "Your father," he coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Your father was the worst of us. Everything we did was his idea." "I know." "Then another cough, "you know you're no better. Same blood, same family, same rot." "No." Adrian's voice was steady. "I'm the one who stopped running from the rot. That's the difference." Ashford's eyes went distant, focusing on something beyond the room. Then he exhaled once more and was still. In the ringing silence that followed, 3 people stood in a hotel room with a corpse on the floor and the knowledge that everything had changed forever. Serafina looked at Adrian, then at Evelyn. "I suppose I should run. I just murdered a viscount. You defended 2 people he was about to kill." Adrian stood, his voice firm. "Self-defense. We'll all testify to it. A duchess who killed one lord and shot another." Serafina's laugh was shaky. "They'll lock me away." "Not this time." Evelyn moved to the window, looking down at the crowds gathering in response to the gunshot. "This time, the whole country knows why. This time you're not just a woman who was told to be silent. You're the woman who refused." Below, constables were pushing through the crowd toward the hotel entrance. Soon there would be questions, investigations, trials, the whole machinery of justice grinding forward. But for now, in this small room with a dead conspirator bleeding out on the floor, Adrian Blackthorne stood between his wife and his daughter and felt something he had not felt in 23 years. Complete, not redeemed. There was no redemption for the years of silence, the complicity, the cowardice, but complete. As if all the scattered pieces of himself had finally assembled into something that made sense. He had destroyed his family's legacy, exposed their crimes, sacrificed his position and reputation and comfortable life. And in return, he had gained the one thing worth more than all of it combined: truth. The door burst open as constables poured into the room, their voices demanding answers, their hands reaching for weapons. Adrian raised his hands slowly, making no sudden moves. Before anyone could speak, Evelyn stepped forward, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "My name is Eleanor Celeste Blackthorne. 23 years ago, my mother was murdered by the man lying dead on that floor, and we have documents that prove it." The constables hesitated, confused. One of them moved to check Ashford's body, while others stared at this young woman covered in soot and blood, who spoke with the conviction of someone who had already survived the worst and had nothing left to fear. And as the sun rose over London, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, the story began to spread. Not just through newspapers now, but through word of mouth. The tale of a duke who destroyed his own family to expose corruption, a daughter who refused to stay buried, a duchess who finally found her voice after decades of silence. It would take months for the trials to conclude, years for all the evidence to be fully examined, generations for the impact to truly settle into history. But in that moment, as constables led them out of the hotel room and into the waiting day, Adrian Blackthorne looked at his daughter and saw her meet his gaze with eyes that held no forgiveness, because forgiveness would have implied he deserved it, but something better: recognition of what they had endured, what they had sacrificed, what they had refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. They had won, not by being good or noble or morally superior, but by being willing to burn down everything, including themselves, to make sure the truth survived. And sometimes, when the system is rotten enough, that is the only victory that matters. The trial lasted 3 months. The proceedings filled every newspaper in England and beyond, drawing attention from as far as New York and Bombay. The courtroom became a theater where decades of aristocratic corruption were laid bare before the public, not in whispers behind closed doors, but in testimony delivered under oath, in documents that could not be denied, in voices that refused to be silenced any longer. Adrian sat through every session, watching as the consortium his father had built was dismantled piece by piece. Viscount Ashford was dead, but 7 other men stood trial for crimes ranging from illegal trade to murder conspiracy. Men who had once dined at his table, men who had attended his wedding, men whose children had played with him as a boy, back when innocence was still possible. The evidence was overwhelming. Celeste's meticulous documentation left no room for doubt, no space for the comfortable lies these men had hidden behind for decades. Shipping manifests showing opium routes, ledgers documenting bribes paid to customs officials, photographs of warehouses filled with contraband, and testimony. So much testimony from people who had been silent for years, finally finding the courage to speak because someone else had spoken first. That was what truth did when it finally escaped into daylight. It gave permission to other truths. It broke the spell of fear that kept entire systems of corruption intact. Serafina testified on the fourth day. She walked into the courtroom wearing black, her face pale but composed, and told the story she had kept locked inside for 20 years. How Adrian's father had summoned her to the East Tower that night. How he had forced her to watch as they questioned Celeste about what she knew, about who she had told. How Celeste had refused to give them anything, had spit defiance even as they backed her toward the window. And how Lord Fairfax had pushed her. "Not my husband," Serafina said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. Adrian's father, the old Duke, stood beside Fairfax. Viscount Ashford held the door to make sure no one interrupted. But it was Fairfax who actually touched her, who put his hands on her shoulders and shoved her backward through the window. And I watched her fall. I watched her try to grab the ledge. I watched her fail. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, his gavel sounding like gunshots in the chaos. But the damage was done. A Duchess, a woman of impeccable reputation, a woman with no reason to lie and everything to lose, had just confirmed what the document suggested. Celeste Arden had been murdered, and some of the most powerful men in England had been complicit. When Serafina stepped down from the witness stand, she walked past Adrian without looking at him. They had not spoken since the night she shot Ashford. They existed in a strange limbo, not divorced, not reconciled, simply suspended in the aftermath of catastrophe. But as she passed, she paused for just a moment, long enough to whisper 3 words. "Thank you, Adrian." Then she was gone, escorted out by constables through a side door to avoid the press gathered like wolves outside. Adrian sat alone in the gallery and felt the weight of those words settle into him. Not forgiveness. Serafina would never forgive him for the years of emotional abandonment, for the marriage that had been a prison for them both. But acknowledgement. That at the very end, when it mattered most, he had done something right. Sometimes that was all you could hope for. Not redemption, not absolution. Just the recognition that after a lifetime of wrong choices, you had finally made one that mattered. Evelyn testified on the 7th day. She wore the midnight blue dress Adrian had given her for the masquerade, now cleaned and repaired, and she spoke with a clarity that left no room for doubt about who she was or why she mattered. "My mother was Celeste Arden. My father is Adrian Blackthorne. I was born 6 months before my mother's murder, hidden away to protect me from the men who wanted to erase any evidence of their crimes." She held up her birth certificate, the one they had found in the crypt. "This is who I am, not a ghost, not a coincidence, a witness to what powerful men are willing to do when they believe themselves untouchable." The defense attorneys tried to break her. They questioned her memory, her motives, her credibility. They suggested she was a fraud, an opportunist, a woman trying to extort money from a noble family. Evelyn dismantled every argument with the cold precision of someone who had spent her entire life learning to survive in a world that wanted her erased. And when the lead defense attorney suggested she had fabricated evidence for personal gain, she leaned forward and spoke directly to the jury. "I grew up in an orphanage where we fought over moldy bread. I spent 26 years not knowing who I was or why I existed. These men," she gestured to the defendants, "took that from me. They took my mother. They took my childhood. They took every chance I might have had at a normal life. And you think I did this for money?" Her laugh was bitter. "I did this because they thought they could murder a woman and bury her daughter and face no consequences. I did this to prove them wrong." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty. On all counts. For all defendants. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Some cheered, some wept. The defendants sat in stunned silence as the judge pronounced sentences that would see most of them imprisoned for the remainder of their lives. Fortunes would be seized, titles would be stripped. Family names that had commanded respect for centuries would become synonyms for corruption and murder. The aristocratic order that had seemed permanent and unshakable had cracked, and through that crack, light had entered. Adrian walked out of the courthouse into a mob of reporters shouting questions he did not answer. He pushed through them with single-minded focus, looking for the one face that mattered, He found Evelyn standing beneath a tree across the street, watching the chaos with an expression he could not read. When she saw him approaching, something flickered across her face. Not quite a smile, but not rejection either. Acknowledgement, perhaps, that they had survived this far and the path forward remained uncertain. They stood together in silence while the world churned around them. Finally, Evelyn spoke. What now? It was the question Adrian had been avoiding for months. During the investigation, during the trial, during the long nights when sleep would not come and memories played on repeat behind his closed eyes, he had focused only on survival, on justice, on making sure the truth reached daylight. He had not thought about what came after, because after meant confronting the ruins of everything he had been. I don't know, he said finally. The honesty felt strange after so many years of careful control. Blackthorn Hall is mostly destroyed. My reputation is demolished. My marriage is over. My title is tainted by association with crimes I didn't commit but benefited from. He looked at her. What do I have left? A daughter. Evelyn's voice was quiet. If you want one. Do you want a father? She was silent for a long moment, staring at the courthouse where justice had finally, improbably, been served. When she spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen. I don't know what having a father means. I've never had one. The people who raised me were kind enough, but they weren't family. They were just adults doing a job. She turned to face him. And you spent 20 years drowning in guilt instead of living. You let your obsession with the past destroy any chance of a present. So no, I don't know if I want that kind of father. What kind would you want? The kind who's learned from his mistakes instead of just drowning in them. The kind who can move forward instead of staying frozen in the past. She paused. Can you be that person? Adrian had no answer, not because he was being evasive, but because he genuinely did not know. For 42 years, he had been the Duke of Blackthorn, a role defined by duty, control, and the weight of family expectation. Then for 3 months, he had been an investigator, a crusader, a man on a mission to expose truth regardless of cost. But now, with the trial over and justice served and nothing left to fight against, he had no idea who Adrian Blackthorn was supposed to be. I can try, he said finally. That's all I can promise. I can try to be better than I was. That's a start. Evelyn held out her hand. Not in reconciliation, the gesture was too formal for that, but in truce, in willingness to see what might be built from the rubble. Adrian took her hand, and they shook on it like business partners sealing a deal. It was not the emotional reunion that stories usually ended with. There were no tears, no declarations of love, no sudden healing of decades of absence. Just two damaged people agreeing to try. To see a family could be something you chose to build rather than something you were born into. To discover if the wounds inflicted by the past could be transformed into something other than more suffering. They walked together through London streets that were just beginning to process what the trial meant. Vendors hawked newspapers with headlines about the verdict. People gathered in pubs and parlors to debate what should happen to the seized estates, the confiscated fortunes, the exposed network of corruption. England was changing. Slowly, painfully, incompletely, but changing nonetheless. And Adrian and Evelyn walked through it as witnesses to transformation, having helped catalyze it even as they struggled to understand what it meant for their own lives. They ended up at a small tea shop near the Thames, far from the courthouse and the press and the weight of public scrutiny. Inside, it was warm and anonymous. They sat across from each other at a scarred wooden table, and for the first time since they had met, they simply talked. Not about conspiracy or murder or justice, about smaller things. Evelyn described her childhood in the orphanage, the friends she had made and lost, the teachers who had been cruel or kind, the moment she had learned to sew and discovered she had a talent for making broken things whole. Adrian talked about growing up as a duke's son, the suffocating expectations, the way every choice had been made for him since birth, how he had loved Celeste because she was the first person who seemed to see him rather than his title, and how losing her had taught him that love was dangerous, that caring about anything made you vulnerable. So he had simply stopped caring about everything. It was a way to survive, Evelyn said. Not a good way, but a way. Yes. Adrian stared into his tea. But I think I've learned that survival isn't enough. Not if it means being dead inside while your heart still beats. So, what's enough? Purpose. The word surprised him even as he spoke it. Not duty or obligation or family expectation, but purpose that you choose for yourself. Something worth waking up for that isn't just avoiding pain. Have you found that? Adrian considered. Maybe. There's a lot of money that was seized from the convicted men, money that came from exploitation and suffering. The courts are deciding how to redistribute it. He looked at Evelyn. I've suggested they use it to fund orphanages, schools for children who have nothing, programs to help people who have been discarded by the system that created all this wealth. She studied him with those silver blue eyes that were so much like Celeste's, but held their own distinct intelligence. You're trying to buy redemption. No. Redemption isn't for sale, but I'm trying to make sure some good comes from all the evil. That seems like a better use of my remaining time than wallowing in guilt. What about Blackthorn Hall? Adrian had been avoiding thinking about the estate. The East Tower was completely destroyed. The main structure was damaged by fire and smoke. It would take years and a fortune to restore it to anything resembling its former grandeur. And he found he did not want to. I'm selling it. The decision crystallized as he spoke it. Or donating it. Maybe it can become a museum, a place where people can learn about what happens when power goes unchecked, a reminder that no one is too powerful to be held accountable. And you? Where will you live? I don't know. The admission felt liberating. For the first time in my life, I don't have a predetermined path. I can go anywhere, be anyone. The possibilities are terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Evelyn smiled then. A real smile. Not the careful mask she usually wore. I know that feeling. After the trial, I'll have access to the inheritance my mother left me. Money I never knew existed. I could open a shop, travel, study, do anything. What do you want to do? Help people like me. People who grew up with nothing, who were told they were nobody. Show them they matter, that their voices count. She paused. Maybe I'll open a school, or a sanctuary for women escaping bad situations. I don't know exactly, but something that matters. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had spent months fighting side by side and were only now beginning to know each other outside of crisis. The tea shop bustled around them with ordinary life, people arguing about politics, discussing business, gossiping about neighbors. The world continuing its endless rotation, indifferent to individual suffering or triumph. And somewhere in that indifference, Adrian found peace. Not the peace of having arrived at some final destination, not the peace of having all questions answered and all wounds healed, but the peace of knowing he had done everything he could to correct the mistakes of the past, and now he could turn his attention to building something in the future. That was what survival actually meant. Not just continuing to breathe, but continuing to try, to grow, to become something other than the sum of your failures and regrets. 3 months after the trial, Adrian stood in the ruins of Blackthorn Hall one final time before signing the papers that would transfer ownership to a trust dedicated to historical preservation and education. The estate looked like a monument to its own decay, walls blackened by fire, windows shattered, gardens overgrown and wild. It looked honest, finally. No more pretense of grandeur hiding corruption, just ruins acknowledging what they were. Serafina came to say goodbye. She had been living with family in Scotland, slowly rebuilding a life free from the weight of being a duchess in a loveless marriage. She looked different, younger somehow, despite the gray in her hair and the lines around her eyes, as if shedding the burden of silence had restored something vital. They stood together in what had been the entrance hall, now open to the sky where part of the roof had collapsed. I'm sorry, Adrian said it without preamble, for the years I made you live in this tomb. For the marriage that was never really a marriage, for being too broken to see how much you were suffering. Serafina was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm sorry too, for not being brave enough to tell the truth 20 years ago, for letting fear keep me silent while you drowned in guilt. We failed each other, Adrian, completely and thoroughly. Yes, but at the end, when it mattered, we did something right. She looked around at the ruined hall. We burned it all down. That takes a kind of courage, too. Or desperation. Maybe they're the same thing. She smiled sadly. Goodbye, Adrian. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. I hope you find peace. I already have. And that, more than anything, is what let me know I made the right choice in leaving. She walked away through the broken doors, and Adrian watched her go with a mixture of sadness and relief. They had never been meant for each other. Two people forced together by families and expectations, trying to build something from incompatible pieces. The kindest thing they could do was release each other to find whatever came next. Later that day, Adrian met Evelyn at the cemetery where Celeste was buried. The headstone had been changed, no longer claiming an accidental death, but stating plainly the truth. Celeste Arden, murdered for pursuing truth. Her daughter Eleanor had arranged it, refusing to let her mother's death be sanitized even in death. They stood before this grave in silence. Adrian had brought flowers, white roses, Celeste's favorite. Evelyn had brought nothing but her presence, which seemed more honest somehow. Do you think she'd be proud? Evelyn's question was soft. Of what we did? Adrian considered carefully. I think she'd be furious it took 23 years, and that her daughter had to grow up alone, and that so many people suffered because good men stayed silent. He paused. But yes, I think she'd be proud we finally finished what she started. I wish I remembered her. So do I. Adrian's voice was rough. But maybe it's better that your memories of her aren't tangled up with mine. You can know her through what she left behind, her courage, her journals, her refusal to accept injustice. That's a legacy worth inheriting. What about you? What did you inherit from your father? His mistakes, and the opportunity to do better. They stood together until the sun began to set, painting the cemetery in shades of amber and shadow. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. I'm leaving England, going to America. There's less history there, fewer ghosts. I want to build something new instead of constantly repairing something broken. That makes sense. Adrian felt a pang of loss but recognized it was right. She needed to be free of everything that had defined her, including him. Will you write? Maybe. If I have something worth saying. She looked at him directly. You could come too, you know. Start over somewhere no one knows the Blackthorn name. I thought about it, but running from the past is what got me into this mess. I think I need to stay and face what remains. Make sure the changes we started actually take hold. That sounds lonely. It probably will be, but loneliness is different from being dead inside. I've learned the difference. Evelyn stepped forward and, after a moment's hesitation, embraced him. It was awkward. Neither of them practiced at physical affection, both of them armored by years of emotional survival. But it was real. A goodbye that acknowledged what they meant to each other without pretending it was more than it was. Thank you, she whispered, for being brave enough to investigate, for refusing to let the past stay buried, for being the father I needed, even if only for a few months. Thank you for finishing what your mother started, for being stronger than either of us, for showing me that courage isn't about never being afraid, it's about acting despite fear. They separated, and Evelyn walked away through the cemetery gates without looking back. Adrian watched until she disappeared around a corner, taking with her the last physical reminder of Celeste and the life he might have had if things had been different. But standing there in the fading light, Adrian discovered he was not drowning in grief or regret. He was simply present, aware, alive in a way he had not been for decades. The past was finally past. The people responsible had been held accountable. The truth had been told, and now the future stretched out before him, undefined, uncertain, but his to shape. He walked out of the cemetery as the last light faded from the sky. Tomorrow, he would meet with the trustees about converting Blackthorn Hall into a museum. Next week, he would testify before Parliament about reforms to prevent the kind of corruption his father's consortium had embodied. Next month, he would begin working with organizations that helped people the system had discarded. Not because it would redeem him. Redemption was not the point, but because doing something meaningful was better than doing nothing at all. And after 20 years of numbness, of existing without living, he had finally learned that the opposite of despair was not happiness, but purpose. You did not heal by forgetting the wounds. You healed by transforming them into something other than pain, into motivation, into determination to make sure others did not suffer the same way, into a daily choice to be better than you were, knowing you would never be perfect, but refusing to use that as an excuse for not trying. Adrian Blackthorn walked through the streets of London as night fell, and for the first time in 23 years, he he was not haunted by the ghost of Celeste Arden. Not because he had forgotten her, not because the guilt had disappeared, but because he had finally done what she had died trying to do. He had exposed the truth. He had fought the powerful. He had refused to let fear and convenience triumph over justice. And that, in the end, was the only memorial she had ever wanted. Not a headstone or a portrait or whispered sympathies, just someone willing to finish the fight. The city lights flickered on one by one, and Adrian walked toward them, toward whatever came next, toward a life no longer defined by the past, but shaped by conscious choice, toward the hard work of becoming someone who could look himself in the mirror without flinching. It would not be easy. There would be setbacks and failures, and moments when the old numbness called to him, offering escape from the difficulty of actually feeling. But he would face them, not because he was brave or noble or fundamentally good, but because he had learned the hardest truth of all, that surviving was not enough, that a life lived in fear and silence was not a life at all, that real courage was not the absence of terror, but the decision to act despite it, to speak despite the cost, to fight despite the certainty of wounds. His father had taught him that power meant control, that strength was measured in how much you could dominate others, that the Blackthorn name was worth any sacrifice, any crime, any amount of suffering inflicted on the powerless. But Celeste and Evelyn, who carried her spirit, had taught him something different. That real power came from speaking truth to those who wanted silence. That real strength was vulnerability, the willingness to admit mistakes and change. That the only legacy worth leaving was one built on integrity rather than exploitation. Adrian had lost everything pursuing that lesson. His title was tainted, his fortune was diminished, his family name was synonymous with scandal. But walking through London that night, no longer Duke of anything, just Adrian, simply Adrian, he felt something he had not felt since he was 22 years old. Freedom. The freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. The freedom that came from choosing truth over comfort. The freedom that came from finally stepping out of the shadow his father had cast and into the uncertain light of his own making. Behind him, the past burned. The old order collapsed. The comfortable lies disintegrated. And ahead, in the darkness lit by street lamps and possibility, a new story was beginning. Not a story about a duke or a conspiracy or a ghost returned from death, but a story about what happened when people refused to stay silent, when they chose courage over convenience, when they decided that some truths were worth telling regardless of the cost. It was a story that would be told for generations. The scandal that brought down an empire, the woman who would not stay buried, the man who burned his own legacy to expose its rotten foundation. But for Adrian, walking through the London night with nothing but purpose and possibility, it was simply his life. Finally, actually, terrifyingly, his own. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.